As trust in institutions continues to decline, countries around the world are rushing to control the flow of information before their citizens completely lose confidence in their governments. Over the last 2 years, many governments have proposed bills which would result in an unprecedented amount of online censorship. In some countries, these bills have already been passed. So today, I'm going to tell you about the online censorship bills in Canada, the UK, Europe, and the US, reveal when these bills will become law, and explain what effects they could have on the internet. Now, I want to start with Canada because its online censorship bill seems to be the most dystopian of them all. Canada's online censorship bill is titled Bill C-11, also known as the Online Streaming Act. Bill C-11 was first proposed in November 2020 as Bill C-10, but failed to pass due to its concerning contents. Bill C-10 was reintroduced in February last year as Bill C-11 and was approved by the Canadian House of Commons, the first of a two-step process to becoming law. The initial approval took many by surprise, including YouTube, which went as far as publishing a blog post warning about the Online Streaming Act. As explained in the blog post, Bill C-11 would effectively give the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTC, the power to decide exactly what content Canadians can see on YouTube and other social media platforms. Note that the CRTC is part of the Canadian government. If that wasn't scary enough, a passage in the bill specifies that these regulations will apply to user-generated content. Besides controlling the amount and type of advertising that would appear on the videos of YouTubers, the CRTC would have the power to dictate what content they make. If you're wondering what kind of content the CRTC would want YouTubers to make, the answer is Canadian content, or CanCon. Basically, if the content does not contain sufficient diversity and inclusion of different ethnicities, languages, and so on, then the content can't be seen by Canadians. Naturally, the definition of these diversity and inclusion criteria would be up to the CRTC to decide. They would also have the power to designate any YouTuber as a so-called broadcaster. Being designated as a broadcaster means comply with the CRTC's criteria or else be blocked in the country. Not only that, but some broadcasters will also be required to contribute to the Canada Media Fund, which is of course used to fund mainstream media in Canada. It sounds like this requirement will only be applied to streaming services and social media platforms, but it could also apply to regular creators. Now this is significant because most of the Canadian media is funded directly or indirectly by the Canadian government via the Canada Media Fund and other avenues. Mandatory contribution by broadcasters would double the size of the Canada Media Fund, further increasing government control of the media. If that didn't make it clear enough, it appears that the Canadian government is desperate to ensure that it continues to control the narrative in the country. This makes sense considering that trust in the government has been falling for years and has fallen off a cliff since the pandemic began. To put things into perspective, 40% of Canadians trusted their government at the beginning of the pandemic. Today, this figure stands at 20%, a more than 50% drop. As you'll soon see, a similarly large drop in government trust has occurred in other countries, but the motivations for censorship vary. As for Bill C-11, it's currently sitting with the Canadian Senate, which will vote on the bill in February. If the bill is passed, then it will be debated by the Canadian Parliament. What's crazy is that tech giants like YouTube have apparently failed to convince the Senate to omit user-generated content from the bill. This suggests that Bill C-11 has a high likelihood of becoming law in Canada, and this could occur in just a few months' time. If this happens, then the internet in Canada will be completely different from the rest of the world, with content curated entirely by the Canadian government, much like it is in North Korea. I suppose such an outcome wouldn't be that surprising given how the Canadian government handled the pandemic. Never mind that many Canadian politicians are part of the World Economic Forum, or WEF, including the Prime Minister. More about the WEF's young global leaders in the description. And speaking of the WEF, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is also a part of the club, as was former Prime Minister Liz Truss, who resigned, and Boris Johnson, who resigned, and Theresa May, who resigned, and David Cameron, who resigned. I think I'm starting to see a pattern here. In all seriousness, the UK has an online censorship bill in the works as well. In contrast to Canada's brazen online streaming act, UK politicians opted for a more harmless title, the Online Safety Bill. The Online Safety Bill was introduced in May 2021 and has been slowly working its way towards approval since then. Similarly to Canada's Online Streaming Act, the UK Online Safety Bill initially came under fire for wanting to regulate, quote, legal but harmful content. This provision would have been a problem because it would give the UK government the power to censor whatever it deems harmful. Now, in the case of the UK, the regulator that would oversee the enforcement of this provision is the Office of Communications, or Ofcom, which is analogous to Canada's CRTC. Thankfully, the provision to police legal but harmful content was dropped from the Online Safety Bill back in November. Phew. Unfortunately, there are other problematic provisions in the bill. For starters, it includes various provisions which direct Ofcom to protect, quote, content of democratic importance, protect news publisher content, and protect journalistic content. Now, this is presumably code for the mainstream media. Moreover, Ofcom still has the power to police illegal content being distributed online. To that end, Ofcom will issue fines to tech companies which fail to police illegal content. These fines will start at £18 million a pop, or 10% of a tech company's annual revenue, whichever is higher. Yikes. The catch is that these fines only apply when the illegal content is shown to a minor, that is, a child. Logically, this means that tech companies will be incentivized to do age verification on their platforms to avoid accidentally allowing harmful content to be shown to minors and then being fined. In practical terms, this means tech companies will be forced to require KYC of some form from all their users. Now, this is terrifying because it would make it easy for social media companies or the government to permanently deplatform critics. The silver lining is the KYC provision may be avoidable with a VPN, or, well, so I've heard. On that note, there is another problematic provision in the Online Safety Bill. In Section 131 of the bill, the authors note that Ofcom will have the power to set restrictions on or even ban so-called ancillary services, including, quote, services which enable funds to be transferred. Now, call me crazy, but this provision sounds like it could have a profound impact on cryptocurrency. DeFi protocols and cryptocurrency wallets technically allow for funds to be transferred. This means the Online Safety Bill could potentially introduce a ban on most crypto services. I really hope I'm wrong on that one. Now, although trust in the UK government also plummeted during the pandemic, this does not seem to be the primary motive for the Online Safety Bill. Then again, it's hard to say because the UK government put its historical trust data into the Historical Archive, which is impossible to search. For what it's worth, around 1/3 of Brits currently trust the UK government, but I should note that these numbers were taken back in June, before all the prime ministerial resignations and the pension market implosion. You can learn more about what happened there using the link in the description. The primary motive for the UK's online censorship efforts seems to stem from a desire for more oversight rather than censorship per se. I suppose we'll find out once the Online Safety Bill becomes law, something that could coincidentally happen later this year, just like in Canada. Probably nothing. Anyways, the next country on the list is Europe, or rather, the European Union. In contrast to Canada and the UK, European authorities separated their online censorship efforts into two separate bills, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Both were introduced in December 2020. Now, it's important to note that the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act are two of 5 bills which make up the EU's Digital Services Package. The Digital Services Package is the second phase of the EU's digital agenda, which, like many so-called agendas these days, is set to be complete by 2030. For those who don't know, this 2030 date you keep seeing has its roots in the United Nations' Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which are being enforced through regulation in the public sector and through ESG investing in the private sector. More about that in the description. Moving on. Unlike Canada's Online Streaming Act and the UK's Online Safety Bill, the EU's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act were both passed in the spring of 2022. Both went into force in the autumn of 2022, but won't be enforced until later this year and early next year, depending on the size of the relevant entity. The same is true for the EU's Data Governance Act, which was passed last summer and goes into force this autumn. The EU is also in the process of passing the Data Act. Both bills are outside the scope of this video, but the main takeaway is the mandatory sharing of data with governments and corporations. Now, the fifth and final bill in the EU's digital services package is the Artificial Intelligence Regulation Act, which will be discussed later this year. The EU's AI regulation is reportedly the first of its kind. Note that all 5 bills are regulations, meaning they will override the national laws of EU countries. Sounds democratic. But back to the meat and potatoes, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. The Digital Markets Act actually doesn't have all that much to do with online censorship, and it could paradoxically make it possible to bypass many of the restrictions that the Digital Services Act seeks to introduce. That's because the Digital Markets Act would impose massive fines on so-called gatekeepers, which maintain their monopolies by giving preference to their own products and services. The implications of this are profound and could do serious damage to big tech company profits. Here's an example. Apple currently has a sort of monopoly inside the iPhone. That's because every app you use must be downloaded from the Apple App Store, and you can't uninstall certain apps. Under the Digital Markets Act, you would be able to install other app stores and uninstall everything from your iPhone if you want. The same will be true for other phones, computers, everything. Given that Apple and other big tech companies make a lot of money from mining your data with mandatory apps and making developers pay massive fees, the Digital Markets Act could deliver a massive blow to their bottom line. Take note. If it wasn't already obvious enough, the motivation for the Digital Markets Act is to increase Europe's competitiveness in the tech space. As noted by crypto policy analyst Patrick Hansen, the EU has been getting wrecked by the US and China on tech development. This bill could make the EU competitive again. More importantly, the Digital Markets Act could open the door to all sorts of innovation in cryptocurrency in the EU. This is simply because there would be an entirely new set of hardware available to crypto developers in the region. Think instant crypto payments or P2P Wi-Fi with iPhones. Now, the only real issue with this bill is that it will also require all gatekeepers to provide detailed data about the individuals and institutions purchasing their products and using their services to the EU. This will be facilitated by the aforementioned Data Governance Act and Data Act, which mandate data sharing. Well, at least it will be possible to uninstall all the surveillance software on your physical devices, until, of course, the EU inevitably makes doing so illegal in the name of safety or whatever. Conspiracies aside, if you've been keeping up with the channel, you'll know I've mentioned the EU's Digital Services Act on a few occasions. That's because it will establish a Ministry of Truth in every EU country, which will censor certain information and push government propaganda. I'm not exaggerating. Each country will have a deceptively titled, quote, Digital Services Coordinator, which will function as a Ministry of Truth. Each Digital Services Coordinator will appoint, quote, trusted flaggers to monitor and take down content. Trusted flaggers will be law enforcement, NGOs, and other unelected institutions. Also, there will be a limited number of trusted flaggers. As noted in the bill, quote, to avoid diminishing the added value of such mechanism, the overall number of trusted flaggers awarded in accordance with this regulation should be limited. Something tells me it's going to be the usual suspects that get picked. As you might have guessed, trusted flaggers will have to submit reports to their respective digital services coordinators, which will act on this information. This information will also be forwarded to the European Board for Digital Services, which consists of digital services coordinators from each country. Regarding the kind of content that trusted flaggers will track and take down, the scope seems to be limited to illegal content, as in the UK. However, the bill suggests disinformation could be on their radar as well. Now, this begs the question of who defines disinformation, and the answer is probably the EU. Similarly to the UK, violators of the EU's upcoming regulations will face fines of up to 6% of their annual income per infraction, and repeated offenders will be banned. The Digital Services Act also contains a provision which could impose KYC on social media platforms in the name of child safety, like in the UK. But wait, there's more. The bill explicitly states that in the event of a crisis, the European Board for Digital Services will instruct social media platforms to enhance content moderation, change their terms and conditions, work closer with trusted flaggers, and tweak the algorithm to, quote, promote trusted information. In other words, the next time there's a crisis, the government narrative will be promoted and opposing ideas and positions will be downranked or deleted. The best part is that there's no limit on how long these emergency social media measures would last. As they say, never let a good crisis go to waste. Now, for your information, the Digital Services Act specifies that a crisis includes, quote, armed conflicts or acts of terrorism, including emerging conflicts or acts of terrorism, natural disasters such as earthquakes and hurricanes, as well as from pandemics and other serious cross-border threats to public health. All I can think of is how weather modification is somehow left out of discussions about extreme weather events, even though 50 countries are actively modifying the weather. Now, I don't imagine this topic will be allowed at all when such a crisis occurs, so consider learning about it using the link in the description. Now, not surprisingly, the WEF is a very big fan of the EU's Digital Services Act and claims that it will be used as the standard for online censorship around the world once its success is seen by other countries. Also, not surprisingly, the WEF has criticised the UK for dropping its legal but harmful speech regulation. This is further evidence to the idea that the Digital Services Act will apply not just to content that's explicitly illegal. The WEF's articles about it suggest they will also include things like hate speech. Newsflash, if people are angry, you should probably try and address the cause rather than censor them. Now, it's safe to say that the EU's totalitarian approach has failed so far. Trust in EU governments fell by almost 25% during the pandemic, and that's the average drop. Many EU countries saw even larger drops in trust. The Czech Republic leads the pack, with just 15% of Czechs now trusting their government. Whereas the Digital Markets Act was clearly created to make Europe's technology sector more competitive, the Digital Services Act was clearly created to control European citizens. After all, the last thing the EU wants is for people to lose trust in it, but these laws will only accelerate that process. I'll remind you that the Digital Services Act starts to go into force later this year, so prepare accordingly. This brings me to everyone's favourite country, and that's the good old US of A. Now, similarly to the European Union, the United States has two significant documents related to online censorship. The first is a bill titled the Kids Online Safety Act, and the second is a Supreme Court case about Section 230. The Kids Online Safety Act was introduced in February last year. The bill is still sitting in Congress, but is expected to pass later this year because it has bipartisan support. Even so, the bill has received lots of criticism from entities outside of Congress and from both sides of the political spectrum. This is because it will force online services to collect KYC to ensure that they're not showing harmful content to minors. Like the UK's and EU's own child protection provisions, the provision in the US bill does not explicitly require tech companies to do this, but the bill acknowledges it's the only real option. As in Canada and the UK, a US government regulator will ultimately decide when kids have been made unsafe online. specifically the Federal Trade Commission or FTC. This part has likewise been criticised because it should be the parents making sure their kids are safe online and not a government regulator. The worst part is that it's not just the FTC that will be issuing fines. The Kids Online Safety Act will make it possible for parents to sue tech companies if their children have been harmed online. It's assumed social media platforms will turn the censorship up to 11 to ensure they don't get sued, even with KYC. Did I mention that a similar law was recently passed in the state of California? Anyhow, this ties into the Supreme Court case about Section 230. For those unfamiliar, Section 230 is a US law passed in 1996 which allows social media platforms to moderate content to a limited extent without violating the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech and of the press in the United States. The Supreme Court case in question is Gonzalez versus Google. The TLDR is that Google allegedly supported terrorism with its algorithmic recommendations and that this contributed to the 2015 terror attacks in Paris, which killed, among many others, an American student named Nohemi Gonzalez, hence the name of the case. Now, Gonzalez versus Google was picked up by the Supreme Court last October after being passed up by various courts of appeal, along with another case called Twitter versus Tamne. The TLDR there is that a Jordanian was killed in a terror attack in Istanbul and that Twitter's algorithms allegedly contributed to the attack. Now, to my understanding, there are two possible outcomes here. If the Supreme Court sides with Gonzalez, then big tech will get wrecked by related lawsuits and will have to engage in more online censorship to ensure no more lawsuits occur. You should know this is the outcome the Democrats are pushing for. Case in point, US President Joe Biden filed a legal brief with the Supreme Court asking them to increase the liability of social media companies under Section 230. The Department of Justice filed its own legal brief with the same request. This is probably putting lots of pressure on the Supreme Court. Now, if you think I'm being partisan, the alternative outcome isn't exactly ideal either. As some of you will know, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were appointed by Republican presidents. Republicans have been calling for Section 230 to be thrown out altogether, arguing that there is too much censorship. As such, the speculation that the Supreme Court could declare Section 230 unconstitutional rather than side with Google. If this happens, then online censorship of any kind would instantly become illegal. Now, this sounds great at first glance until you realize that this would also apply to algorithms. It doesn't take a computer scientist to understand that the internet won't work very well without algorithms. Yet this is the kind of internet we would have if Section 230 is cancelled. Now, in theory, the ideal outcome would be for the Supreme Court to side with Google and for Congress to change Section 230. In practice, though, giving Congress the power to change Section 230 would likely result in even more online censorship. Consider that trust in US institutions has been falling fast and recently hit record lows. The least trusted institution is Congress, with just 7% of Americans trusting US politicians. Damn. In any case, the Supreme Court will hear arguments for both Gonzalez versus Google and Twitter versus Tamne in February. It's very unlikely that a decision will be made anytime soon. Until then, we'll have the pleasure of watching Western countries introduce widespread online censorship in other ways. I'm not religious, folks, but I'm honestly thanking God for decentralized social media right now. Let's just hope it's going to be ready in time.